Hey everybody, and welcome to episode 48 of the Revive Yourself podcast. Here we go.
Are you sick and tired of being sick and tired? Have you got a health issue that just won't go away no matter what you try? Then welcome to the Revive Yourself podcast, where we reveal the secrets to long-lasting health by getting to the root cause of problems that no one else is talking about. So you can have more energy, clear skin, healthier hair, a leaner physique, more confidence, and most importantly, do the things you love and live the life you deserve. Here's your host, Ryan Martin.
So guys, welcome to episode 48. We're getting close to 50, I was just thinking. Almost at the half century, 50 not out. So thanks once again, guys, for always listening and being such great listeners and a great audience and always giving us such great feedback. I know we've been really getting out to all you guys across the world, getting some listeners from all over. So thank you for that, guys. And also, everyone that's on the free 4-day mini course, well done. You're doing really well. And those of you guys that have got any chronic issues, head on over to www.reviveyourself.co. and you can sign up for that. It'll teach you how to get through any of the issues you've been dealing with, chronic issues, anything from IBS to skin issues, etc., thyroid issues, fatigue issues, etc. Otherwise, guys, we're on to episode 48, and this is with Dr. Glenn Livingstone, and it's all about how to never binge again. So we're going deep into this topic because, it's very easy for people to use say junk food as comfort food, and why is this? Well, we go into that. We go into the let's say brain science, the neuroscience around this, and we go into Dr. Livingstone's own experience with this, and I even talk a little bit about why this is, having done neuroscience myself, and about the different aspects of the brain, different parts of the brain, what parts you're in, and how it all relates to you eating this, and what you can do to stop this, what you can do. In fact, at the end of the show, we're actually going to do another episode with Dr. Livingstone. He's going to work on me a little bit, just to show you how he works, but this is a fascinating episode, and we go deep into binge eating and how you can overcome it. So, without further ado, here he is. Here's Dr. Livingstone. Here's episode 48, and I'll see you on the other side. Hey guys, and welcome to episode 48 of the Revive Yourself podcast. Today's guest is Dr. Glenn Livingstone, all the way from Portland, Oregon, and we're going to be talking about his book that he's authored called Never Binge Again. So, welcome to the show, Glenn. How are you today?
I'm very good. I'm happy to be here.
We were just talking off air, and he was saying that the weather's actually not too bad where he is at the moment, but he had 14 years of terrible weather in Hampshire, New Hampshire. Is that correct?
Yeah, the state motto in New Hampshire is live free or die, but we always joke that it should be live, freeze, and die.
I think is New Hampshire, is it quite near New Jersey? Is that correct?
It depends upon your definition of near. It's
Okay.
It's New England. It borders Canada.
Right. Okay.
And it borders Maine. It's just north of Boston.
Well, I think I remember seeing that on a Sopranos episode once, just the live free or die on another place. That's why I think it was one of the I was thinking he was from Jersey. So anyway, I digress. So we're here to talk about your book, Never Binge Again. What really caught my eye is that a lot of the things, we're going to go into your history and why you got into it, but the fact that your research, 40,000 participants, and it's all self-funded. Now, that's almost unheard of these days, especially because most research is done by Big Pharma, bought and paid for, as you probably know. So I just want to say well done on that, to be honest with you.
Well, I first of all, that was in the days of extraordinarily cheap internet clicks. So most people don't remember a firm called GoTo, which became Overture, which then became Bing. I believe it became Bing. But back then, you could get people to your website for a couple of pennies, and it was over the course of a few years. And I actually was a consultant to Big Pharma and Big Food, which I'm not really proud of, but I knew how to do those. I knew how to do those studies, so I didn't have to pay for the labor. So it's not quite as impressive as it sounds, but it was equally as valid, and it was a strong study, and it found a couple of interesting things. It didn't solve the problem, but it found a couple of interesting things. So thank you.
That's cool. No worries. So just before we get into, because what we want to talk about is, we're going to talk about overeating, stress eating, binge eating, and then sort of how to what I want to talk about as well at the end is reprogram yourself to think like a permanently thin person. It's one of the topics that we mentioned, which is really good. But your story, Glenn, how did you get into? Because you're a psychologist. So how did you get into that? Was it always your love?
Yeah. Well, with overeating, I like to eat.
Right.
Put it that way. Treating overeaters was not my profession for years and years and years. It's only something I really started doing as my late 40s and early 50s. I was born in a family of psychologists. My mom, my dad, my aunts, my uncles, my cousins, there are 17 therapists in the family. And we often joke that if something broke in the house, we knew how to ask it how it feels, but we didn't know how to fix it. So,
17, that's a huge amount.
Yeah, if you say Dr. Livingston, I presume everybody turns around and slaps you. But the thing is that from the time I was really little, when I was 4 years old, I heard my dad on the radio, and I asked my mom why he was on the radio, and she said he's a psychologist. And I said, well, what's a psychologist? And she said, well, that's someone who makes people happy when they're sad. And I said, I want to do that. Why is he on the radio? And she said, so he can make more people happy when they're sad. And so that's who I always was first and foremost, and that's it's kind of important as the story goes along. But I also, I'm not just a psychologist that decided to work with overeaters. I had a very serious binge eating problem. And when I was an adolescent, I didn't think it was a problem. I thought it was a superpower. I could, I'm 6'4", I'm reasonably muscular. And if I worked out for a few hours a day, I could eat whatever the heck I wanted to. I mean, a couple of pizzas, boxes of muffins, 6 or 7, they didn't call them lattes back then, but something that approximated that. Munchkins, whatever you could imagine, I did it. I don't think I had a vegetable until I was 21. And I was thin. But when I got to graduate school and I got married and I was commuting and I had all these responsibilities, I couldn't find the time to work out more than 45 minutes 2 or 3 times a week. And my metabolism was slowing down anyway. And I found that I just started gaining weight because I couldn't stop thinking about food. I always felt like food was free. It was just this free drug. And I just went to town on it. And this really bothered me in particular because I was so dedicated to being a psychologist, and I very much wanted to help the people I was working with. And I had chosen to work with very high-risk populations. So I worked with a lot of suicidal people. I worked with people right after an affair in the marriage when everything was at risk. Right. And it was, it was really these situations which required my 100% presence. But I'd be sitting there thinking, when can I get out to the delicatessens and dislodge my jaw and empty the contents of the deli tray into it? That's what my life was like. And that really, really bothered me. But coming from a family of psychologists, I looked for a very psychological answer. I figured that there was something wrong and I had to love myself thin. And so I looked for where that hole was inside of me. So, I never had kids and I never commuted. So I had a lot of time to, after graduate school, I had a lot of time to work on my career. So in addition to my clinical practice, I did a lot of consulting for industry. And I knew how to run those studies. And so I set up that 40,000 person study, and I looked at the foods that people had trouble eating, where they couldn't stop, and various personality and life satisfaction variables, how stressed they were and how satisfied they were with different pieces of their life. And I found 3 things in the study. One thing I found was that people like me who struggled with chocolate, because my binges always started with chocolate. They would end with, pizza and Pop-Tarts and all kinds of stuff, but they'd always start with chocolate. And I found that people like me who struggled with chocolate tended to have more loneliness or heartbreak in their life. I thought that was interesting. And people that struggled with salty, crunchy things like pretzels and chips, they tended to have more stress at work. And people who had more trouble with soft, chewy, starchy things like bagel and bread and pasta and maybe pizza, they tended to have more stress at home. And I figured that was going to be a significant finding, and all I had to do then was figure out how to solve the problems at work or at home or in people's love lives, and then the requisite problems would go away, the corresponding problems would go away. So I started with myself, and I was in not such a great marriage, and I was pretty unhappy, and I figured, well, okay, so there is loneliness and heartbreak in my life. And I went and I talked to my mom, who was also a therapist, and I said, Mom, you know my upbringing better than anybody. What is it about my upbringing that would create this connection between chocolate and, loneliness or heartbreak? And she got this horrible look on her face, and she looked really embarrassed. And I said, Mom, it's okay. It's a long time ago. Just tell me. And she said, well, Glenn, when you were a little boy, when you were a toddler, you were often coming running to me, crying, wanting food, wanting hugs, and wanting love. But honestly, I was overwhelmed. My dad, your grandfather, was in prison, and he, for a while he was missing. We didn't know what happened, and I was very, very depressed about that. And your dad was a captain in the army, and they were talking about taking him to Vietnam. I guess I'm revealing my age. Mm-hmm. And so honestly, sometimes I was just so depressed I was sitting and staring, and I didn't have the wherewithal to respond to you and hug you and love you and feed you. So I got a big bottle of chocolate Bosco syrup, and I put it in a refrigerator on the floor. You probably don't remember this because you're like 1.5 or 2 years old, but when you come running up to me, I'd say, Glenn, go get your Bosco. And you'd go running up to the refrigerator, you'd get out the Bosco, and you'd suck on the bottle, and you'd go into a chocolate sugar coma. And I thought, wow, that's got to be it. There's the match that struck the fire. Now that I know this, I should be better. But the thing was, I didn't get better. I felt more forgiving of myself. I understood the problem better. I wasn't as self-castigating. I felt more forgiving and compassionate with my mom. It led to a whole series of conversations about her life back then, and how she chose my dad, and the struggles in her marriage, and all kinds of interesting things that deepened my relationship with my mom and deepened my self-esteem in some ways, because I was no longer torturing myself about the psychological aspect of it. Mm-hmm. But it didn't stop the binging, because there was this crazy voice in my head that said, Glenn, you're right. Your mama didn't love you enough. It's not her fault, but she didn't love you enough. And until you can figure out how to fill that hole inside of you, we're going to just have to go right on binging on chocolate. Let's go get some right now. Yippee! And I'm exaggerating a little bit, but that's basically what happened. Was that,
Glenn, can I just say, this is fascinating stuff, and we've covered it maybe a little bit before with a guest, but this is to do with, as you probably obviously know, being a psychologist, the brain chemistry and things, but what gets fired together gets wired together, correct? So obviously it's why people go and have comfort food. It's one of the questions I actually wrote down, that comfort food, one of the things, if she doesn't give you chocolate milk, she should then give you her breast maybe to feed. So we equate comfort with sugar. And so straight away people are going for that. And it's something that people don't understand enough of, I think. And that's such a great story that you're telling people there, because sometimes people beat themselves up. They don't understand these things that get fired together from a young age, get wired together. And it's really, you've got to do some deep work to understand that. So I just wanted to say that's brilliant.
Well, that's a really good point. And the real point is that it doesn't really matter what match struck the fire. No. These things have a life of their own. Because the principle of neuroplasticity, what fires together wires together, associates the gratification and the reward with the chocolate. Mm-hmm. And look, there was no chocolate bars on the savannah. We didn't have chocolate trees right in the tropics as we're evolving. We didn't have that. This is an invention of industry for profit. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with chocolate. Some people don't have a problem with it at all. For some people, it's a lovely thing. But for a lot of people, it has corrupted your survival drive. And a lot of the work that I did with industry, I know that there are billions of dollars going into engineering food-like substances that are like hyper-palatable artificial concentrations of starch and sugar and salt and oil and excitotoxins and things to things that target your lizard brain on a level which evolution did not prepare you for.
No. You're a conspiracy theorist. I don't believe it, Glenn. Never. This isn't happening. That's what people will say. And I'm sitting here with a big smile on my face because what you're saying is so true. It's one of the questions I actually wrote down. People don't get addicted to sweet potato, organic sweet potato. They don't just sit there and eat bowls and bowls and bowls of it, you know, or normal potatoes. It's always these foods like once you pop, you can't stop with Pringles and chocolate and pretzels and whatever things you're saying where they're trying to find that bliss point, the scientists with the salt and sweet and etc. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I'm sitting with a big smile on my face as you were talking about because it's just what people need to hear this because I don't think people understand how much these industries are doing this. So you buy their stuff, you know.
It's not only the food engineers that create the substances that are addictive in the first place. And remind me, I want to tell you about an animal study that really shows what the impact of these, you know, hyperpalatable pleasure things are. Yeah, but the advertising industry is very, very good at spending their billions to make you believe that this stuff is healthy. I remember a VP at a major food bar manufacturer, a really good guy, but. Mm-hmm. He told me, I mean, you guys will all recognize it if I said the name and then I get sued. But he told me that their critical insight was when they realized they should take the vitamins out of the bar and they should put the money into the packaging instead. Mm. They took the vitamins out of the bar because it was making it taste bad, and they put the money into making it appear healthy, so vibrant colors and you know shiny packaging and all this money spent on testing the packaging. And so it's perfectly legal for them to fool you into thinking that things are healthy. Yeah. And the majority of the public thinks that advertising is stupid and that it doesn't affect them. And the reason that the advertising industry keeps spending money on that is because advertising impacts you more when you think it doesn't affect you. Your sales resistance is down. Really? And so everybody's walking around thinking it doesn't matter, but there are billions of dollars spent on it. Once you pop, you can't stop it, but you can't have just one. Yeah. And then, Ryan, the addiction treatment industry, based on no evidence whatsoever, there is no evidence whatsoever that addiction is a disease. There is no evidence whatsoever that people are powerless to stop. But based on that evidence, even with the only two scientifically controlled studies that have been, or quasi-controlled studies that have been presented, showing that, you know, these treatment programs are no better than doing nothing at all. They're either at parity with or no better than doing nothing at all. The addiction treatment industry says you're powerless to stop on your own. You couldn't quit if you wanted to. The best you can do is hope to make progress, not perfection, and abstain one day at a time. Now, I'm not saying there's nothing good that goes on in those programs, but it's the wrong overall message. And so you combine these things, and you've got a perfect storm that says, you know, what says that you're powerless over this, you're constantly stimulated by it, and people walk around feeling hopeless, chronically ambivalent about whether they should eat this or that, chronically tortured by food obsession, and they don't really understand what's going on, and they tend to blame themselves. They tend to degrade their own self-esteem and experience a feeling of shame, rather than getting freaking mad at what's going on in the world today. So I'm sorry you got me up on a soapbox about that.
No, 100%. I completely agree. Yeah. I think it's something that people are worried too much about the wrong things and they don't actually understand what's going on. And then you say stuff and they think that it's all conspiratorial or whatever, and it's just like, I've been doing this so long now, it's just a matter of fact, and it's just a matter of time until they unfortunately learn the hard way. And that's what I did. That's why I got into what I do. I was very ill for 5 years, and that's why I went down this rabbit hole. And when you go down this rabbit hole, as you found, it's just like you keep on finding things, and nothing becomes, nothing becomes unbelievable because of what's going on. I mean, carry on with it because it's something people just need to know more and more about. Because as people don't understand, it's not just when you're talking about binging as well. It is a psychological thing, then it becomes a physical thing, and it just all rolls into one, you know, and it just becomes a bigger problem.
Yeah. So, just one more little piece of evidence, and then I want to try to shift into some practical ways to overcome this, and I'll tell you how I overcame it myself. Yeah. Because it's actually a lot simpler than it seems. Mm-hmm. there's a whole series of animal studies in the late 50s and early 60s. And, I'm kind of an animal rights advocate, and I don't think these studies should have been done, but they were done, where they implanted electrodes starting with rats in their brains in the pleasure centers. And they wired those electrodes to a lever that the rats could push themselves whenever they wanted to, so they could self-stimulate with pleasure in a way that evolution hadn't prepared them to do. Well, what do you think happened? Those rats wanted to press those buttons thousands of times per day. That's all they wanted to do, was just go press the button. And then the experimenters wanted to see how salient was the desire to press the button as compared to other needs. And it turns out that it was the most important need that they had when they were able to do that. So they would ignore their survival needs.
Really?
Starving rats, they wouldn't eat. They'd just keep pressing the button. Nursing mothers would abandon their pups to go press the button. Rats would crawl over a painful electrical grid to go press the button thousands of times a day. When you provide the mammalian, and this was replicated in higher mammals and eventually humans, when you provide the mammalian brain with a means to artificially stimulate the pleasure centers in ways that we didn't evolve to manage, the result is severe self-neglect. The result is that we neglect what's actually required for our survival.
Mm-hmm.
And so put it all together.
I was just saying, that's fascinating. Sorry, that's fascinating.
Yeah. No, it really is. And so when you put it all together, you realize that these things have a life of their own. It doesn't matter that my mom was the one that struck the match and got me set up with this pattern. Neurologically, this thing has a life of its own. Societally, this thing has a life of its own. There are, big fat guys in white suits with mustaches that are laughing all the way to the bank because they're profiting from us buying these pleasure buttons. And, people kind of need to shift the shame to anger. And, but then the question is, what can you do about it? So after about 30 years, literally 30 years of just going to psychiatrists and psychologists, and I knew the best ones because I was in New York and my family was in the business. Mm-hmm. I learned a lot as I went through. I'm not saying I'm sorry that I did that, but going to Overeaters Anonymous, in the end, nothing really worked, and I just started getting more and more obsessed with food. And at different periods, I was 60 or 70 pounds overweight, and my triglycerides were 1,100, and the doctors were telling me I was going to die by the time I was 35. Was it your favorite part of the day? Because I know people. Just sorry to interrupt you there, Glenn, but just okay. I know people that, for example, even my father, for example, he was come from a poor family, and they had to eat sugar sandwiches when they were young, And from that point, I think my dad always had a bit of an issue. He's actually very lean, always been lean, can eat what he wants. He actually developed diabetes later on because I think he always had a bit of a thing about food, like he had to have it, or like if it was there, it had to be eaten, and he had to eat it because he never knew when he was getting it when he was younger. Was this, and it always seems to be that when he's eating, even now we've reversed his diabetes, etc. When he has his meal, he really enjoys it. It's one of his favourite parts of the day. Was that with you? Did you? Are you looking for it? Was it a subconscious thing, or was you consciously really enjoying that food at the time? Oh no! I live to eat. Right. It was great. The thing you have to watch out for is that there's this voice in your head that says you're going to be giving up the world's greatest pleasure. Yeah. And life's not going to be worth living without it. That is so true. Sorry, mate, go on. I keep saying things that I think are priceless because I think a lot of people think that if I can't eat and drink what I want, what else am I going to do? Well, and you're supposed to feel like that. That's the way these foods are engineered to make you feel. You're supposed to feel like it's a matter of survival because they've actually corrupted your survival drive. So if there are two parts of you, there's this part of you that says, I know I shouldn't be eating this. I have all these healthy understandings of nutrition. I want to be eating, paleo or vegan or, low carb or whatever your particular dietary philosophy is. And you know that you feel best when you do that, but you're constantly being derailed because there's this crazy voice in your head that, says chocolate grows on a cocoa bean, and cocoa bean comes from a plant, so chocolate's a vegetable. That's the voice of your survival drive having been corrupted towards this stuff. What it ignores, the idea that you're going to be deprived of pleasure forever, that ignores the fact that your taste buds have been down-regulated by the supersized stimuli that you've been consuming. When you eat sugar sandwiches week in and week out, day in and day out for years, your brain thinks that something has to be that sweet in order to produce the dopaminergic reward response in the brain that nature intended. And the natural dopaminergic reward response has been down-regulated. So the brain just doesn't respond the way it's supposed to. The good news is when you stop eating sugar and you start eating fruit, your taste buds double or triple in sensitivity in a matter of weeks. Your brain begins to upregulate and you begin to experience the same level of pleasure or more. Well, not quite the same. There's a certain high that you get from sugar that you'll never get from a banana. But the pleasure is pretty close to what you're used to. And the difference is that there's no roller coaster ride associated with it. So you get the pleasure, but you don't get the crash. And there's more of a contentment as opposed to a manic high, which is why I tell people that it's better to change their paradigm. And instead of thinking of food as, instead of thinking of the idea that you want comfort food, I'd like you to think that you're looking for these industrial foods to get high with food, that it's almost like a drug.
Right, yeah, that's the way of thinking, yeah.
So is it okay if I shift to the part where I found a practical strategy that worked really well?
Go for it.
This is you can probably tell that I'm an educated, sophisticated guy. I don't wear a lot of suits or function at tea parties very well, but I've had a lot of education. I've done a lot of things, and I'm kind of a sophisticated consultant. But the solution I found was not sophisticated at all. I had been reading a lot of alternative addiction literature. Things that would take me outside of the 12-step programs because I just seen the evidence that really wasn't working. It certainly wasn't working for me. And I came across a guy who wrote a book called Rational Recovery. His name is Jack Trimpey. And he works largely with the black and white addictions, like alcohol and cigarettes and drugs, things that you can quit entirely. You don't have a need for them in your life, as opposed to food, which is something you have to take the lion out of the cage 3 times a day and walk it around the block.
Yep.
And what he basically did for me was he shifted my paradigm. So I think anybody struggling with drugs or alcohol should go read his book and don't bother with mine.
What was it called again?
It's called Rational Recovery.
Rational Recovery.
But if you're struggling with food, then I'm the guy to go to. Basically, what he did for me was he shifted the paradigm, and he said, look, addiction targets the lizard brain. The lizard brain is this structure which evolved millions of years ago, and the way that it works in the environment is nothing to do with love. So if you're trying to love yourself thin, you're making a mistake. The lizard brain sees something in the environment and it says, do I eat it, do I mate with it, or do I kill it? Eat, mate, or kill. There's no concern for other people or tribe or family.
Yeah.
There's no concern for long-term goals and aspirations or creativity or art or music or religion. None of that. No spirituality. It's all eat, mate, or kill. This is like a bodily organ that you have to take control over. Same way that you take control over your testicles or your ovaries. You don't allow the impulses generated by your testicles to tell you that you should run up and kiss every pretty girl on the street. At least I don't. If you have to urinate, you don't allow that very strong biological urge to be expressed in ways that are not good for your place in society. There's a place and time that you do.
Yeah, you don't wet yourself, for example. Yeah, you don't just walk around wetting yourself.
Yeah, well, except for that one time I was stuck in traffic in Boston, but we won't talk about that.
You don't normally wet yourself. That's what
you don't normally wet yourself. But what he said was that you really needed a method for dominating the lizard brain rather than loving yourself out of the addiction. And I took that to mean the difference between nurturing your inner wounded child or capturing and caging a rabid animal. And for so many people who struggle with overeating, I find that the solution has to do with capturing, caging the rabid animal rather than nurturing that inner wounded child. And I mean, I'm a really compassionate guy. If you listen to some of the recorded coaching sessions that I do, you'll say, hey, this guy's got a really weird theory, but he's kind of loving in practice. But this sounds kind of harsh. Here's what I did. Here's how I did it. I decided that my lizard brain was going to be my pig. Not a real pig. It's just a mental construct. I love real pigs in the world. They need our help, but this is a mental construct. This was my pig, and I was not going to eat like a pig. So my lizard brain was my pig. I was going to draw really clear lines in the sand. So, for example, I will never have chocolate on a weekday again. Monday through Friday, I would never have chocolate. I'll tell you why I use that as opposed to a guideline. And then I would say the chocolate itself is pig slop. And if I heard the pig squealing for slop, I would say, well, I don't want that. My pig does, and I don't let farm animals tell me what to do. I never eat pig slop. And as ridiculous and crude as that sounds, as embarrassing as it is for someone like me to say that, that's what gave me the extra microseconds at the moment of impulse to wake up, remember who I was, what kind of person I wanted to be around a particular food, and start to make the right decision. And it wasn't perfect. It took some time to experiment with and kind of get used to. But it was a dramatic change. It really shifted the direction of my eating. And that's how I lost my weight. That's how I recovered. And that's how I just started to separate all of my constructive versus destructive thoughts about food. And I decided that I was done. I'm just tired of this destructive thing in my head having control. I'm tired of letting industry, profit from my misery. I wanted to live a long and healthy life. I believed that my pleasure apparatus would readjust so that I wouldn't really be deprived in the long run. I might feel deprived for a month as I was getting used to it. Mm-hmm. And that's what worked for me. That's what really worked for me. I kept the journal. I kept the journal for a lot of years. And then I published it on a whim. I edited the journal into a book, and I published it on a whim. And it took off. It's very frequently the number one book for weight loss, eating disorders, and I forget the last category, weight maintenance on the Kindle, on the free side. So that's what I do now. Now I have a coaching network, and I help people to stop binge eating using this really, really weird method.
Yeah, no, and obviously people can find you at www.neverbingeagain.com. Their book's there. But just quickly there, Glenn, when you started that, because obviously you said it's quite a quick fix. You didn't want to feed your pig. For a lot of people, I mean, you had to have consciously done that, right? Because I mean, the unconscious can take over, and before people know it, they're sad, they're depressed. Before people know it, they're in the fridge, they're eating chocolate, and they've eaten all the biscuits, they've eaten the whole pack, and they don't even know what's going on. So you have to consciously, it's sort of like you have to give things attention, because if you're not giving things attention, I can't remember what part of the brain it is. Maybe I'm trying to think. I can't remember. Is it the medulla or something? It takes over, and
it's the reticular activating system.
Because that's the way you can just get in the car and drive to, for example, from London to Liverpool, and you not even know what gear you're in because it's subconscious, correct? So you have to make this part of your conscious daily activity not to do this for a while for it to kick in, correct? Because to start with, it won't just be easy for most people to do.
Yes, it's kind of like learning to drive. When you first learn to drive, you have to learn the rules of the road.
Right.
What do you do at a four-way stop? When do you have to slow down for a yellow light? What does a blinking yellow light mean? There's a bunch of stuff you have to study. But once you've studied it and you've driven for a couple of months, you don't even really think about it. Mm-hmm. Like just like you said, you can drive around without having an accident, and it's mostly unconscious. But it does require that initial conscious effort to reprogram yourself. And that conscious effort, if we'd stay with the same analogy, it surrounds finding the dangerous intersections in your life and deciding whether you want to put a stoplight or a stop sign or a yield light or a yield sign. What level of control do you need to put there?
Yeah.
So I tell people, look, you can have a rule that says I'll never eat chocolate again. Or you could have a rule that says, I'll never eat chocolate on the weekdays again, or I'll never eat chocolate, except for at a social event again. You can construct the rule any way you want to. It can be totalitarian or it can be conditional. You can also create rules for what you always do. Like I always put my fork down between bites, or I always have 6 ounces of water as soon as I get up in the morning, or I always meditate before I turn on my computer. What you want to do is define these things as lines in the sand that don't have any ambiguity in them, because it's ambiguity that lets the lizard brain come through. See, the traditional advice in our culture is to create guidelines as opposed to rules. So you'd say, well, I'm going to avoid chocolate 90% of the time. But that's a really big problem. And the reason the research is indicating that's a big problem now is because willpower is not like an on-off switch. It's not something like you have or you don't. It's more like gas